this series of talks this month was primarily dedicated to the, how should we put it, to the ambience, the psychological and cultural ambience that existed at the time, and in part for the benefits of Madame Blavatsky. And so my emphasis is on the possible and impossible occult events and influences and activities that went on at that time. And when trying to calculate as to which countries to include, we included on the end all of Eastern Europe, the main figure of which for many centuries was, and perhaps will be again, Hungary. And of course that delighted me greatly, because as most of you know, I am a Hungarian, and actually probably one of the greatest turnarounds of my life, one of my greatest awakenings in more recent decades was in 2009, when we went to Budapest, which was the first time I entered my homeland since 1947. So, and I must say that if I had not been able to fulfill that particular engagement, which was arranged largely by my friend Michael Gomes from New York, and through the what do they call themselves, the theosophical
European Theosophical Society?
excuse me? No, the organization that sponsored us there.
Just the regular Theosophical Society, or
No.
the European School of Theosophy?
That's it, yeah. So in any event, I must say that whoever arranged that had done me a great favor, because I literally felt rejuvenated and revived even, which is another step below rejuvenation, when we were there, and when I saw how magnificently our beloved city of Budapest has been rebuilt, refurbished, and rendered once again enthusiastic and really Hungarian. And I have not only never forgot that, but it's inside of me. It was sort of my second birth. And as such, I imagine that I would be down below, deep down below, if that hadn't happened, because it really gave me a leash for life. So that's just to give a little bit of background to the story. Now then, that being the case, I also desperately tried in my tremendously disorderly quarters to find some of the books that I bought years ago, and which have really nice pictures of Hungary. And I did, to my great joy, found two. To my great sorrow, did not find the others. But the two others are here. You are welcome when we get up and afterwards and things like that to open them up and look through them. One of them is primarily about the city of Budapest, and the other one is about the countryside. They are very good photographs, and I think you will like them. The Hungarians were good photographers for a long, long time, and they have not lost their art. Now, with that, we need to keep in mind, by way of introducing this curious subject, that you might say that the psychic atmosphere and the cultural milieu, as we would call it in French, of Europe was very heavily centered in Eastern Europe at the times that we are talking about. In fact, another thing I have to find, I have some, they're rather small, but I have some little maps of Hungary in the office, which I will bring out so you can see what I'm talking about. But let's say as such, I think it's justified, even just from a historian's point of view, to take a good look at the cultural and historical scene at that time in Europe, because in many ways it was centered and made lively primarily by Eastern Europe. Now, that being the case, I need to remind you of something that probably none of you remember, because you weren't here when it was said, which is in your favor, namely that the spiritual atmosphere imbibed by and subsequently utilized by Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, who was not always Blavatsky, because that was the result of a marriage that she regretted, an experience that a great many married people share with her. And so, let's say, she was born, as I mentioned before, the daughter of then Colonel Peter Alexeyevich Hahn, H-A-H-N, which in German means rooster, always one of my favorite animals, whether in or out of the frying pan. And so, let's say, which is interesting, you know. I usually bring these things up because they are unusual details that hardly anybody mentions, and yet they are of importance. The Hahn family are the descendants of a German knight in the Middle Ages who was with the Crusade in the Holy Land. Maybe the Hans should come back now and go to the Holy Land again. But in any event, and the reason that they got that name, von Hahn, from the rooster, was because a particular knight, German knight, was a bit of an insomniac. Maybe he already had some of the visions that his granddaughter would have later on, namely HPB. But let's say he woke up in the middle of the night and couldn't sleep, and he went about the camp looking at everything of what was going on. And as he was looking, he saw the enemy, the Saracens, the mullahs of that day, creeping up on the camp in order to capture it. So he sounded the alarm, and the knights all woke up, and they beat the heck out of the invaders, and everything was fine. And so I think whoever the ruler was over this particular crusade, I think probably the Holy Roman Emperor made this family noble and gave them the title of von Hahn, from the rooster. And their coat of arms is that or a rooster. Now, whether that is of interest really or not, I'll mention it just the same once again, that the von Hahn family is still very much around. And in fact, some years ago, a cousin of mine, first cousin, daughter of my mother's sister, married a von Hahn in Austria. Well, when that happened, it so happens that we just that Sunday, because we had our public lectures on Sunday, we had a news of the fact that this Hahn gentleman married my cousin, and we also had that Sunday. We always had a Sunday afternoon lecture in those days. And then for the lecture that Sunday we had Mr. Boris Zirkov of blessed memory, who was sort of a second cousin of H.P. Blavatsky. Very, very learned, very wonderful man. He's the one who started the editing of the collected works of H.P. Blavatsky. And when Mr. Manly Hall consented to publish the first volume, which is volume 5. Some others were published before. Anyway, so I went up to Mr. Zirkov, whom I was quite friendly with already, and I said, Mr. Zirkov, look, my cousin just married a von Hahn. You think that is the same lineage of HP? He said, all the von Hahns are one family. You are now my relative. So that certainly brightened my day, shall we say. So let us say these things are all true, but they also all, let's say, lead to the fact that they were interesting connections here, and that a lot of these connections were, at least in part, familial. The people whom you associated with, the people who became close to you in various ways throughout the years, were usually your relatives. I had so doggone many relatives that I couldn't count them. And some of them are still around. In any event, there is a certain what should I call it? There is a certain mystique to relations. There is a certain mystique to family lineage. And this mystique was very much present, especially in 19th century Europe, but even in my days. And it creates connections, including this little one that I just mentioned. So in any event, as I mentioned in an earlier lecture, in very early medieval times, Eastern Europe was pretty much one gray sea of Slavdom, meaning that there were the northern Slavs, there were the southern Slavs, and they extended way down toward the Balkans. And then something happened, for which I'm somewhat grateful, because in a very remote sense I sort of belong to it myself, and that is the fact that the Hungarians came. And the Hungarians, of course, did away with this particular division. We are now coming to about the year 900 AD, which is sort of Middle Ages. And at that time, across the Carpathian Mountains, which are the main mountain range that divides present-day Hungary from the eastern direction, in came a strange people. They were riding very fast and very agile small horses. They were themselves expert archers, bowmen, and they definitely were looking for a new place to settle. So after about 900 AD, the Carpathian Basin, as we might call it, when I bring the map you can see it, it's sort of it's a semicircular geographical area, and the semicircle is posed by the Carpathian Mountains, the northern Carpathians and the eastern Carpathians. So now an entirely new factor entered Eastern Europe. Of course, the great and for some people fatal consequence of that was that the northern and the southern Slavs were now divided by an entirely different ethnic group that got in the middle, and they never reunited again. And so you might say that the Hungarians, with their little horses and long arrows, were the reason for the northern and southern Slavs never to reunite again. Now I say that with a certain amount of energy, but I really had no trouble and no dispute with the Slavs, but I could see how this could well kind of spoil your lunch. And so it was. But in any event, from then on, there was this strange little people who were nomads, hunters and warriors coming from the east, who probably originated in the Ural or Altai region, which is a certain southern extension of the Ural Mountains. You know, the Ural Mountains in turn kind of cut Russia sort of in half, and the northern half is Siberia, and then the rest of it is Russia. In any way, that is what came to pass, and the Hungarians were a strange folk. For one thing, they were very fun-loving, and their fun consisted in going into strange lands, stealing everything they could find, make off with some of the women, make off with other treasures, primarily horses, and then get on their own horses and go back to Hungary. Now, if you have that kind of a neighbor next to you, you will probably notice in short order that you're not very comfortable, because you really don't know when they're going to come down on you again. and consequently more and more concern arose in the European nations. So what are we going to do with these wild Hungarians? And eventually they found a way, and that way was religion. In other words, after about 100 years of being in the present country of Hungary, the Hungarians began to wonder whether they are going to last there a long time if they remain unschooled and unbaptized pagans, which they were. And so eventually one of their leaders, they referred to them as the princes, had decided that the only way they're going to survive and remain in charge of the land that they had conquered would be if they converted to the Christian religion. So he sent emissaries to the various ecclesiastical authorities, including to Rome, and they in turn sent the missionaries, primarily Benedictine monks. You know why? Because they were the only monks in existence at the time. The Benedictine order is the first monastic order of Western Christendom. The East has the Basilian monks, and well, you know, maybe it's one of the missiles. In any event, Saint Adalbert of Prague, who was the Archbishop of Prague, also a Benedictine monk, and various others, came to Hungary, and it would seem that in very quick order and very efficiently converted the populace to Christianity. Of course, their own prince said, look guys, if we want to live and do well in this neck of the world, you have to accept this Christianity. And they said, yes, sir. And so on it went. He also had his son, who was just a young man at the time, baptized, and his son received the name of the first martyr and the first deacon in the Bible of Saint Stephan. And he became Saint Stephan, the first king of Hungary, the first Christian king, and the great-grandfather of the Hungarian royal dynasty for a long time, for at least a century or so. And that being the case, now there was a completely different constellation, so to say. And interesting to note, and I always mention that because to me symbols mean more than facts. In fact, I would like to, if I have to, really, absolutely have to come back to this miserable world where we are, then I want to come back in a world where there are no facts, no fact world. If some of you are literary geniuses, you could take this idea and now conceive of a whole big novel, great big thick one, something about no fact here or something like that. Anyway, don't take these things too seriously, because they are not meant that way, they are not done to be taken that way. In any event, from then on, the Hungarian people, of course, occupied, populated the entire Carpathian basin, which extends from the northern Carpathians going on, extending toward what they call now Ukraine, and so all the way down to what was Yugoslavia. So you constantly have to change the names in that part of the world. And once it's Yugoslavia, then it's Serbia, then it's Croatia, then it's this, that, and the other thing. So it's amazing and annoying. However, let's say from then on, the Hungarians were the overlords of that entire period, but at the same time, even though they were a clannish, small people from Asia, they still were quite hospitable to people who came in, as long as they promised to till the land and give the proceeds to the Hungarians. What else? The first great move having been done by Saint Stephan the King, my patron saint and the patron saint of Hungary, who sent for approbation of his royal status and of the status of the Hungarians to Rome, where a very interesting pope reigned at the time, the Pope Sylvester II, another Dominican monk, who was very taken with the mission of Saint Stephan and what was going on in Hungary. The Sylvester II, or Gerbert, the monk as he was called before, was an interesting man from our and maybe Blavatskyan point of view, because while he was a great churchman, he also became well known as a great magician. He was called the Magician Pope. So it was ever after it was sort of known a little bit as we call sub rosa in Latin, under the rose, which means a little bit concealed, that the Hungarian kingdom was established by a very prominent and very active pope who was also a magician. The few reports that we have of the magical activities of Gerbert, subsequently Sylvester II, it indicated that he had gone, he was French, he was a French monk, that he had gone from France to Spain, which in large part was occupied by our friends the Muslims at that time, of course, because the Reconquista had not occurred yet. And it was well known that the Arab scholars, including the ones in various cities, but particularly in Toledo, which I remember as the principal place where absolutely excellent, unbeatable steel was made. So when you found, we had one at the house, when you found a knife, a dagger with Toledo steel, then you wouldn't let go of it, because it was worth its own weight in gold. So anyway, they were. One has to remember that no matter what may have happened on the way, so to say, that there was a time when the Arab culture, especially when located in Spain, was really quite high and had insights into a great many things. For instance, the mathematical art of algebra, which we were all tormented with at some time in school, came about as a result of the activities of Arab mathematicians in Spain, particularly one mathematician, Muhammad ibn Musa al-Khwarizmi. So see, when you get my age, you'll forget all the important things that you should remember, and you remember all the unimportant things. So this is one of the unimportant things. And he wrote a big tome on a particular approach to mathematics, which was called Algebra val Mukalabava. And that was the first document of using letters of the alphabet, of the Arabic alphabet, obviously, instead of numbers. And I tell you, it was quite a gift, because when in the 4th class of the kind of school I was going to, they introduced us to alchemy, I was so happy. Well, hallelujah, no more numbers. Well, it didn't quite work out that way, but it was almost no more numbers, because I don't like numbers. I really don't. It's a big pain. So in any event, the algebra, the manipulation of numbers in a letter form became quite an important adjunct to the general mathematical sciences. So in any event, we had all of these cultural elements there, and some of these had even, I wouldn't say infiltrated, but influenced the Vatican in Rome, and thus brought Pope Sylvester II to the papal throne. And he sent Saint Stephan a crown, and this crown is, thank God, is still in existence, and is now, if you go to Budapest, which you should do, because I understand with every year it's becoming more magnificent. If you go to Budapest, go to the Houses of Parliament, which incidentally, just without too much bragging, was built by the great uncle of my mother, who was Minister of Building and Transformation at that time, and who had that and the famous bridge, the first bridge over the Danube, also built. In any event, I'm not bragging in behalf of him, but I could bring his portrait to show you sometimes. He is, even in the communist days, he was known in the press and in the newspapers and things like that as the greatest Hungarian ever, Stephan Count Széchenyi. In any event, when you don't have anything to brag about for yourself, then why not brag about your ancestors, Everybody's got something or somebody to brag about, and if he hasn't, then he should make it up. Okay, so there we are about that. But anyway, the crown which he sent is known ever since known as the Holy Crown. The Holy Crown of Saint Stephan is a bona fide, very high degree ecclesiastical relic, and it, after about a year or two, I think Saint Stephan still had it when there was something added to it. And so now when you see it, it's really composed of two parts. There is a diadem part, which is open on top, goes all around with various holy images on it, because it is of Byzantine origin, as I will tell you. And then the top, which is closed in and which since the 19th century has a bent or crooked cross. And how it acquired that is quite a story, but I don't think we need to go into it now. But the two fused together symbolize the fact that Hungary considered itself the country where East and West met. The East and West being the Holy Roman Empire and the Roman Catholic Church. That is the and then the eastern part in turn being coming from Byzantium and having already taken over much of Russia and the various eastern countries. So the Hungarian the dynasty of Arpad, which was the one that Saint Stephan belonged to, Arpad having been the conquering leader when they came into Hungary. So it sort of became known that the East and the West needed to come together. And if you observe with some degree of care, because superficial observation seldom leads very instructive results. I am sure that this has appeared to you already. So you have to have your noodle going when you meet something new. But the explanation was that the Eastern Empire, which was the Empire of Byzantium at that time, and the Western Christianity, if they come together, then they have a mighty power, and they remained as such. And I'm mentioning this for a reason. Well, I mention a lot of things without a reason, but I'm mentioning it for a reason because what this meant was that beginning with the crown, which incidentally, according to the first constitution of the land, was stated that anyone who is not crowned with the Holy Crown of Saint Stephan is not king. So it is regarded as a very, very special magical object, if we want to put it that way, coming from a magician pope and sanctioned by the Byzantine emperor. It was really quite a thing. And it is so to the present time. I mean, there have been Hungarian kings who were not crowned with the crown of Saint Stephan because they were afraid that then they would have to follow the Hungarian constitution. So you see, people already had problems with constitutions in those days. They didn't have to wait for Washington, D.C. but in any event, so it was a symbol of the two cultures. They were really cool. They still are, although one is now very much down in the dumps, namely Eastern Christianity, that the Western Christianity centered in Rome, and the Eastern Christianity centered in Constantinople needed to come together and to interact. And there they were in the one crown, you see. So it's that in itself was a symbol of the way that the early Hungarian kings, including Saint Stephan, wanted the country to go. Because you see, we have these two empires here. The Holy Roman Empire, which was usually centered in a German city, or in Vienna, which was a German city also, and the Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Christianity, centered in Constantinople. Of course, they did not count with one thing: the Turks. And as a comic performer said some time back, everybody knows that the Turks are jerks. So don't remember this, it's too low a joke, but especially since it rhymes and all that, I thought I should mention it. Because things that rhyme, that's kind of magic to words that rhyme. In any event, but these were the two great powers, sometimes in rivalry with each other, but also supplementing each other in various ways, which were of very great importance. And it was, well, for about another 300 years, maybe a little more than 300 years, that this arrangement continued. And I, being somewhat observant, particularly of ecclesiastical customs and so forth, I can testify to it, that the Hungarian Roman Catholicism differs from other, not tremendously, but in various details, rituals, holidays, vestments, various things from others, because it contains elements of Byzantine or Eastern Orthodox Christianity. You can see that particularly in the way the Hungarians observe the Easter holidays and things of that sort. I don't think that you will be too interested in the details, but the fact is that an effort was made quite early in the foundation of the country that somehow we should take advantage of the two great spiritual forces, namely the Byzantine Orthodoxy and the Roman Catholicism. Now, why did I bring this up? Because what kind of a church was little Helena von Hahn baptized in the Russian Orthodox Church? And again, most theosophists wouldn't like this, and so I'm saying it here. I probably won't say it at the big meeting at the end of this coming month in Canada, but the fact of the matter, this is an exact quotation from a letter of H.P. Blavatsky that I read. The quotation, it was this, and it said that better than Protestantism, which I loathe, she said, but what he said. There was some. I think it was at the time when Pope Pius IX, who was a very tough character. Pope Pius IX was fighting Garibaldi and the ones who wanted to unify Italy and therefore throw out the rule of Rome of the Vatican. So here he had his own troops and everything. He was fighting the Garibaldists and so forth. And HPB, on the other hand, with her Masonic connection, because Garibaldi was very big Freemason. So she was obviously on that side. But she said, but with our Holy Orthodox Church, Holy Russian Orthodox Church, I wouldn't even compare Buddhism. So if people come and they tell you that Blavatsky was a Buddhist, well, yeah, she went to Tibet and various parts and she was very familiar with various aspects, but she said it, she wrote it, it's in print. So what is that? It means that she was loyal to the faith and to the customs of her ancestors, and she did not give that up. And I think that is an issue that probably should give us thought, because I think it's generally speaking. Again, you never can generalize about these things, but generally speaking, it is helpful to stay with your own ancestral traditions and faith. And I never had any respect for the people. Today they are Buddhists, tomorrow they are Shintoists, the day thereafter they are communists, and incidentally, that brings up another issue, probably even more important. I also read in the collected writings of H.P. Blavatsky where she said, anyone who is a communist should never be a member of our society. So if you are a member or would-be member of the Theosophical Society, keep that in mind. And when did she say? Well, she definitely said this in a very emotional moment, which was upon the assassination of Tsar Alexander II, who was known as the greatest, the most charitable, the most lovely Tsar that ever lived, and who was assassinated by the anarchists and communists when riding in the carriage in St. Petersburg. And Madame Blavatsky was incredibly sorrowful about it. You know that the same Tsar also offered his navy to Abraham Lincoln in the Civil War. That he knew that the Americans didn't have much of a navy, and he said, if you could use, and the Tsar's ships were massed outside of San Francisco Bay, ready to come in. But President Lincoln felt that he didn't need it, and who knows, maybe he would have won the Civil War more quickly. But in any event, he was this Tsar was very friendly disposed to America, and really an absolutely wonderful man. And they laid a bomb to the place where his carriage was coming, and it blew up, and it killed, I think, one of his retainers who was driving the horses. So the Tsar got up, to help the wounded man, and while he was attending to the wounded man, another bomb blew up and killed him. Pretty sad situation. But the important thing is the comment, is the saying. So I often say when I come across these kind of wishy-washy socialists and semi-communists and real communists, and like, come on. All right, look what Blavatsky said. If you are that, then you are not one of us. And that makes me extremely happy because I couldn't be of that. I have seen too much. In any event, great revelation that you can put up in your mental library, because I mean, from a purely theoretical point of view, Marxist socialism, which is totally materialistic, this historical materialism, can have absolutely no crossover to Blavatsky's theosophy. They are like two things that are completely opposed to each other. And it's important to remember, that's why I was extremely unhappy when in the 60s all kinds of Marxist elements came into the New Age. I can tell you just a little one to tell you what a character I am. So I had my place on Melrose Avenue, and every Tuesday we had an evening that was the evening for Tolkien. That was when Tolkien's Lord of the Rings came up and so forth. So this was known kind of throughout the city, signs and everything. So in came a young fellow carrying a few things, and he said, "Is this the?" Yes, I said, "This is the Tolkien evening." So he was fussing around with his bag, and he pulled out a little book. The book was red, and the book was Mao's little book. And I said, "Fellow, you take that little book and put it in your pocket and get out of here. And you don't come back with that miserable mass murderer's book. Anything else, okay, but that, all right?" He said, "All right, thank you, sir." We went out. Next Tuesday, he was there without Mao Zedong. So, Hoeller said that's how intolerant we are. To tolerate falsehood, bloodthirsty falsehood, is no virtue. No. And anybody who practices it doesn't know what the heck he's doing. But let's say it started with Blavatsky. Because Marx and some of these weirdos were hanging around already in the free rooms of the British Museum, writing their tomes, which became the Bible of fools for 100 years or more. In any event, Blavatsky knew what was going on in the underground at the time. And Blavatsky knew, for instance, that the Hungarians were related to the Eastern Orthodox and the Russian Orthodox Church, and that therefore they had some good influences. She didn't like Pope Pius IX very much, but then afterwards she said, "Oh, well, I found out that he had been initiated of Freemason, that makes him look better." And she said that too, So in any event, what I am trying to indicate are vignettes of the cultural influences that were present in the 19th century, and then of course later on in the early 20th century also, and that would have had an influence on the ideas, on the practices, on the theories, on the visions of H.P. Blavatsky. Because you have to remember that even when you are dealing with a saint or you are dealing with a great prophet, the material that they are presenting to the people, the prophet's prophecies, shall we say, where do they come from? They come from the culture. They didn't all come straight from heaven. And if they did, nobody would understand them, probably. But so that we need to keep in mind that if in Blavatsky we had a militant anti-communist, you might want to consider a similar stance at the present time. Because the communists not only have not become better, but they have become worse. By taking over Russia, by taking over China, by taking over Cambodia, with all of these things. And therefore, definitely the kind of spiritual cosmology that Madame Blavatsky put forth in the Secret Doctrine and elsewhere is incompatible with philosophical materialism. And anybody who can see that, I would say, well, and I know a good what do you call an eye doctor, ophthalmologist, so that you will see better. And anyway, that's one thing. So let's say there was a strong spiritual background to Hungary and to the Hungarian people from the time that the Hungarian kingdom was established. And so for a period of time, Hungary became sort of instead of being looked at as a mass of menacing brigands who would make excursions into the rest of Europe, The Hungarian marauders on their little horses, they made it as far down as Switzerland. And this the Hungarians considered a great deed, of course. And so there's quite a famous Hungarian ballad, a long poem, has been written about their carryings on in a monastery in Switzerland. All the things that they steal, how they argue about this, how they argue about that. So, the Hungarians were no saints, but once they caught on to the Christian religion, both in its Western and its Eastern expression, that did change things a great deal and really put the stamp of Christianity and of the Christian philosophy. I mean, I'm talking here, not talking here about churchianity, so that remained with Hungary to the present time and created its own martyrs even in my time, when my last image at that time of my country when I left in December of 1947 was the image of Cardinal Mindszenty, the great hero of the Hungarian people, who stood there at the railroad station and giving us his blessing, because we were a train of children that was sent out of the country. Because we were all, I guess I was probably about as skinny as a 15-year-old as I am now. So to do something that away with that. So our attachment to the religious foundations of the country was very great and remained very great. Now that brings up something. What kind of spirituality, what kind of thing that could be called a religion did the Hungarians bring to present-day Hungary? Well, they were pagans. Pagans meaning non-Christian, in those days at least. And that was their principal fault in the eyes of the European people, that they were not like the rest of the Europeans, and they would do things that the Christian religion forbade. So now with all of that, what did it consist of? Well, they brought an Asian shamanistic practice with them, which had, of course, a lot of it was destroyed then when country became Christian. But you've got to keep in mind that, still people, the Hungarians, somewhat like the Spaniards, are great record keepers. They like to write things down. And so Saint Stephan had his scribes writing down all the details of what kind of beliefs they brought with them and so forth, and where they needed changes and everything else. Very good literary style, by the way. And so there is the indication, once you put various items of doctrine together, that what the Hungarian kingdom was trying to establish was a form of Christianity that would be helpful and acceptable to the Hungarian people, and would continue to do them some good. So it was. As I mentioned, and once again, you might say that the various important customs within which were state as well as religious, were very greatly observed. And in subsequent years and centuries, there were even, I think there were only two kings who did not want to abide by the Hungarian constitution. So the Archbishop said, no crown. I said, all right, no crown. And Joseph II, who was a Habsburg, really a very admirable man in many ways, but he was one of them. And he received the honorific title subsequently of the king with a hat, because he didn't wear a crown. So in any event, of course, the Hungarians were not left unmolested. And in fact, that's another thing that they would have had in common with the Russians, or if you want to call them now Ukrainians, because after all she was born in the so-called Ukraine now, that the difficulties that she encountered in her life were in part probably due to her Russian Orthodox upbringing, but she was nevertheless faithful to it. You know that Madame Blavatsky, people don't generally know this, it's only mentioned in a few books, that when she was baptized, I think in Kiev, which was the biggest city around there, when she was baptized, the Orthodox priest said, "This is going to be a very great and unusual woman. This little girl is going to become somebody very important and along spiritual lines." So I think HPB said herself, "Well, he gave me a double dose of holy water." So, so if somebody is trying to make H.P. Blavatsky or early theosophy out to be some kind of an atheist movement or something like that, they are way offline, because that was certainly not the case. But now we need to keep in mind what was really her, and we can't, we obviously cannot solve these things this many years after, and then from such a different perspective as to what really happened to Madame Blavatsky. What came along that made Madame Blavatsky HPV? And we can only speculate, because after all we were not next to her, you know. But let me share you my speculation, because that's what, after all, a lecture is all about. And my speculation is that somehow, along the line, while still in Russia, no Tibet, no India, no nothing, that came later, she had some very unusual experiences. And people didn't know about that. Here or there were some rumors. I remember that I read some rumors. Well, you know, in her family there were a lot of people who were very astute alchemists, and that she had mentioned that she learned a great deal. This was actually not even her grandfather, but her great-grandfather, who was a Russian prince. You know, the Russian aristocracy was composed of, I don't know how many, 300-400 princely families who were all descendants of Rurik. In any event, so her spiritual convictions, which she subsequently put into theosophy and her books and everything else, they were based on primitive personal experience of her own when she was a real young girl. And this was seldom, I mean, there were rumors about that. But comparatively recently, I think there are two issues, recent issues of Quest magazine, which the astute editor, who is really a very good guy, had republished, and in one of them, she is writing to her great-grandfather. Those Russians, you know, copious quantities of vodka every day, and they live forever. So in any event, she reminded her godfather how she studied in his alchemical library, and as to what results she already had obtained. And she said that of the two principles that she was working with, the white is now overtaking the black. So in certain schools of alchemy that would be very meaningful, because what you get is, first you have the four, and then the four change into three, into two, and when they are two, then they are just black and white, or the masculine and the feminine. So she said, I have, in so many words, I have arrived at that point, great-grandfather. And then she writes to her cousin, Prince Alexander Dondukov-Korsakov, who was the last great Russian statesman before the Soviets came, and she writes the same thing to him, that I have discovered something, that if one does the alchemy inside as one should, then one gets to a very important, to a very high place. Now these are my words, but that's what she said. In other words, she discovered that there are ways in which the human nature can be changed into something supernal that consists of the union of the opposites of the black and the white, or whatever else you want to call it, and that is, let's say, a further great step in the development, what later on, unfortunately, they called evolution of the human psyche. So we have the documentation of what she spoke of. And then what happened subsequently is that she apparently received some kind of empowerment, some kind of commission to bring this to people. But how is she going to do it? There has to be a world view, something that the Germans call Weltanschauung. There has to be a cosmology within which this further development of the spirit of the human race takes place. Then you just say, listen, a lot of these current yogi bears who teach spiritual disciplines and so forth, see, if you're going to do this, you're going to be enlightened. This kind of thing. Yeah, sure. But the issue here is that there has to be a framework within which these things take place. The Christian saints, so many of whom did really miracles. I mean, there is this series, there's a number of books out that is called, let's see, what is I have them, what is their title? They Flew. And in this, an Oxford scholar, but he is of Cuban origin, so the Catholic background is still there, has written this very impressive, very well researched, large book in which he goes through the lives of about a dozen saints, if not more. They're all Catholic, Roman Catholic saints, maybe a few Orthodox among them, and indicates that when in a certain kind of spiritually altered state of consciousness, people can defy gravity, and that they can fly, and that this is documented over and over again. For instance, I always wondered how Saint Teresa of Avila, whom I greatly revered, how did Saint Teresa of Avila get at lightning speed from Avila, where her monastery was, to Madrid, where she went to visit King Philip and others? Well, she flew. So when they weren't watching her anymore, and that the capacity to fly, even to bilocate, to be in two places at the same time, is not at all uncommon in the records of saints. Okay? Quite interesting. So what we have here then really is a certain universal recognitions, which, however, have to find their place within a certain context. With Blavatsky, as you know, we have no context. Because the modern people, you see that there were the modern people around that time. Modern people don't believe in anything anymore, and it was already the beginning of the materialistic scientific era. But there is empirical evidence that there are miracles, that there is flying through the air, that there is bilocation, and this. In this particular case, these are miracles within a religious context. So how should I put it? The framework, the rationale within which the miracles fit, is their religion that made them saints. So that was their cosmology. Now Blavatsky said we don't have that kind of cosmology, so she started nosing around because some things were there already. The spiritualists were there. And they sometimes flew around the room too in seances and so forth. And all kinds of things. So we have to construct a cosmology, a Weltanschauung, whatever you want to call it, that makes room for not only the making of miracles, but for the transformation of the human being. What Jung came to call, what did Jung call it?
Individuation?
Yes, individuation, you got it. It's good to have a trained psychologist in the house. Yes, individuation. In other words, certain changes can occur in human nature when certain prerequisites are met, but they have to be understood also within a cosmology wherein they function. So it's like everything in this world needs a framework. And so she wrote the framework, the secret doctrine. That's what that is. Now, because what the heck, how is my individuation going to be facilitated by reading about Atlantis, about Lemuria, about prehistoric strange beings who looked like pudding bags, all kinds of things like that. How does this cosmology work? If you look at it as science, you're barking up the wrong tree of life. It's not science. Of course, a lot of theosophists would smash my head in if I say that. It's not. But you know what it is? It's a myth. It's a mythic book that doesn't have to be factual. It doesn't have to be like that. And I had discussed that a number of times in below the beautiful oak trees of Ojai, California, with the late Joy Mills, who was, I think, one of the smartest and one of the most fabulous theosophists of my lifetime, along with others. And she said, "What do you think the secret doctrine is? It's a myth. It has to be understood as a myth. So reading the secret doctrine, take some of the books of Joseph Campbell and learn how to interpret a myth. But if you make a fact out of it, you're going off into it." And I think this is also very important. After the years that I stayed up all night reading that blasted secret doctrine, I had how many volumes is the most voluminous one? The original was three volumes, and then it's probably about 6 or 7 volumes. Very nicely bound, very nicely. So, I said, so if we look, so you don't have to go and find Atlantis under the ocean. I don't like to get into the water anyway. I never learned how to swim, just like I never learned how to drive a car. There are some things that bother me, and the things that bother me I don't do. Why should I? I mean, there are other things you can do that don't bother you. And it was probably quite unnecessary to bring forth, but nevertheless. So the issue is that, so she created a vast, complex, beautiful, enjoyable series of myths. And she undoubtedly felt that if people read this with a proper intuitive sense, then they will come up with some theosophical data, but not ordinary facts. And you can also see, if you read the secret doctrine, or Isis Unveiled for that matter, which I want to always remind you, Isis Unveiled was printed and bound and put to the public in Los Angeles, California, in a place called South Bernal Avenue, which is sort of in a Hispanic district now. And it was understood that these matters have to be regarded mythically, symbolically, allowed to get into your psyche and begin to start the kind of transformations there that you are supposed to receive. But if you don't have a framework like that, no, I don't mean that you have to believe in Atlantis, although it's a nice myth, I always liked it to some extent, because when I was a very little kid, back in northern Hungary, my mother was long before I could read, my mother was reading to me, and they brought me books and so on. We were a bookish family. And there was one particular story in this collection. It was in the German language, because we were bilingual. And this was the story of Vineta, the sunken city. And that it is a legend that is told on the shore of the North Sea in northern Germany, and it has to do with the fact that there was a beautiful city there, small, no doubt, and then came a big earthquake and it went down to the bottom of the ocean. And that the fishermen They, particularly when there's a nice clear day, and they can look on, they can hear the bells of the sunken city, and they can see the towers of the churches and the things that were there. So it is there, but you have to learn how to look for it. Now that to me is another version of Blavatsky. And this is much more convincing to me than Atlantis and Lemuria. Why? Because it captures the imagination, because it stirs up the soul, because it leads you to insights and to visions. You see, the issue is not to run after people who are supposedly clairvoyant, but okay, how about becoming maybe that yourself? Work at it. Try to. I assure you that at least in some regards you will succeed. I was so terrified back in would be back in the 50s, where all of a sudden one of my ideas that came up became true. I saw this. Did I dream this? No. I saw it because it was presented in a mythic context, and therefore it caught my imagination, because I always liked myth. That is, these things have to be remembered, and if you experience that sort of thing, then it will appeal to you, and then you will be able to do it. So it's very, very important. But don't try to factualize things. Don't mount a ship of fools that went out looking for Atlantis, and they went to, this really happened. They were led by a kooky university professor. Haven't they led every weird stuff? In any event, they went to the Spanish coast, and so the Spaniards became a little bit suspicious. What are you looking here? Oh, we are looking for Atlantis. Oh, really? This was still on the Franco. He says, I don't think we want people like that in Spain who are looking for non-existent sunken cities. So the issue is, you will find your Atlantis, your Lemuria, your sunken reality, if you look for it right here. Because that's where it is, that's where it always has been. But what do you mean there was no Atlantis? I didn't say that there was none, but I just said that it wasn't like you imagined it from the book. So you see, these things need to be remembered. Things can be very, very real without being physical. Our world has to learn that sometime. Whether the physical comes from computers, or what is it now, the big deal, AI or IE, or it sounds like a donkey brain. Yeah. But really, it's asinine in more ways than one. But what you must listen to is what has been called the still small voice within. If you listen to it well, if you listen to it long enough, then you will find. H.P. Blavatsky was one of those people who did that, did it very successfully, and was able to pass it on to a very large number of people, and it's still here. and she has been justly called the grandmother of the New Age, and she has much more could be said and much more should be said. But she has brought into the world a world view upon which can be based actual, true, verifiable occult experience. Occult experience. We had a very, very fine gentleman in this lodge years ago, of course, long gone now, English gentleman. He was a nautical engineer, and he's the one who coined the term here. He says that what we need to work on more is the mysticism of theosophy. Now, mysticism is not a bunch of astral bodies. And let me throw it in again just to be ordinary. Neither is it a belief in all kinds of masters. Experience. And if you experience, if you are led to the experience, then you know. Without experience, you don't know. You can read 1,000 books, you can go to 1,000 clairvoyants, and some of it might be interesting. But interesting is not transformative. It's the tickling of the psyche. Yeah. So we need to keep it. So that is, in my humble estimation, really what Blavatsky did. And hopefully in a much more successful way, and hopefully with some approbation on the part of people present, this is what I intend to present at the big meeting in Canada, because I think by taking this turn we can discover real theosophy. Not just things to believe. If somebody tells you you should believe this and believe that, I'll tell them, get out of my room. I went through that from the day that I was baptized and I was in a monastery and all that sort of thing. Oh yeah, I have been told to believe a lot of nice things. But you know what? I still did not know. But you can know. You can know. And Blavatsky tried to construct a framework for us, and she was on the verge of constructing the outer, let's say, the way of dealing in our imagination with these mysterious things, which work. But one has to get to them. And since we are so factually oriented in this body civilization, that's what people will do. Oh yeah, sure. There is on Vesak night the Buddha appears in the Gobi Desert. Well, you know what? Of me going to the Gobi Desert to see the Buddha appearing is very, very slim. The chances of that are very, very slim. But you can have the experience of the Tathagata, of the enlightened one, of the wise one, in all kinds of ways. If you open up your intuition, if you move toward the truth, and then you have gnosis, and you can have that. That is why I, in my own bumbling way, introduced or reintroduced the concept of gnosis into the theosophical fold, because without gnosis there is no real theosophy. On the other hand, you might say without theosophy there is always a theosophy with a gnosis, because the mythical, theoretical element has to be there. But I think that unfortunately she did not live long enough to bring all of this out into the open. But if we look at her with the deeper vision, if we look at her work with the third eye, so to say, then we will know what she knew. We will be able to pass that knowing, that gnosis to others, and then everything will have been accomplished. That is what she wanted to accomplish. That is what we still must accomplish. And this is just a little excursion into that field, because there is a mountain of evidence indicating that not all that Blavatsky brought has even been touched, not even a tiny bit. The time comes now to touch it, the time comes now to understand it, the time comes now to fly with it to the moon. Well, thanks very much.